Oh God, here we go. The groan from my grandson Jake was a physical thing, a wave of adolescent contempt that washed over the dinner table. He rolled his eyes, a theatrical slow-motion gesture for the benefit of his sister, Chloe, who rewarded him with a quiet snicker, her face illuminated by the cold blue light of her phone. My son David stared intently at his plate, suddenly fascinated by the pattern on the porcelain. But it was my daughter-in-law Susan whose voice cut through the air, sharp and thin as a shard of glass. "Lillian, please. No one is interested in your tedious fantasies. The neighbours can hear you." The words hung in the sterile air of their modern dining room. They didn't just sting, they landed like a punch to the gut, knocking the breath from my lungs. The story I had been about to tell, a real story, a memory etched into my bones, died on my lips. It shriveled up and turned to ash in my mouth. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, and the pristine, white-walled room vanished. For a heartbeat, I wasn't in Maple Creek 2025. I was back in the biting cold of a Berlin winter, decades ago. The metallic taste of fear on my tongue. The memory was so vivid, so real, that the sudden return to the present was a form of whiplash. I opened my eyes. Nothing had changed. Jake was still smirking. Chloe's thumb was still scrolling endlessly through other people's lives. David was still a statue carved from parental disappointment, and Susan was watching me with a look of pure, unadulterated irritation, as if my very presence was a stain on her perfect beige-coloured life. My hands, wrinkled and spotted with age, were wrapped around the birthday gift that had started it all. A box had been slid across the polished oak table a few minutes earlier. "Happy birthday, Grandma," Jake had said, the words monotone, devoid of any warmth. Inside, nestled in cheap tissue paper, was a ceramic mug. On its side, in a bubbly, childish font, were the words, "World's Best Grandma." It felt cold and heavy in my hands, a hollow piece of mass-produced sentiment. It was the kind of gift you buy at a gas station, an afterthought, a checkbox ticked off a list of obligations. "Just what I always wanted," I had murmured, the lie tasting like dust. I'd tried to force a smile, but my facial muscles felt stiff, uncooperative. The mug was a symbol of how they saw me. A generic, one-dimensional caricature of a grandmother, not a person, not Lillian. Just a role to be tolerated, to fill the suffocating silence that followed. I had started to speak. It was my 82nd birthday after all, a milestone, and milestones trigger memories. "You know," I'd begun, my voice a little reedy, a little frail. "This reminds me of another birthday. I was in a safe house in East Berlin. It was freezing, colder than you can imagine, and the only thing I had to eat was a stale piece of bread." That's when the groan had started. That's when the wall of their disdain had slammed down. Tedious fantasies. The phrase echoed in my head. They had said it so many times in so many ways that it had become a part of the house's foundation. It was in the way Susan snatched a glass from my hand, claiming I was too clumsy. It was in the way David spoke to me in that slow, patronizing tone reserved for children and the senile. It was in the vacant stares of my grandchildren, who saw me not as the woman who had held nations' secrets, but as a faulty appliance that kept spouting nonsense. I looked down at the mug again. "World's Best Grandma." The irony was so bitter it felt like poison. A world's best grandma wouldn't have memories of learning to kill a man with a piece of wire. She wouldn't know the precise weight of a cyanide pill hidden in the seam of her coat. She wouldn't be haunted by the faces of ghosts, of colleagues and enemies whose lives had intersected with hers in a violent, shadowy dance. A world's best grandma baked cookies and knitted sweaters. I had dismantled bombs and broken codes. The silence at the table stretched, becoming thin and taut, ready to snap. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic tink-tink-tink of Chloe's fingernail tapping against the screen of her phone. David finally cleared his throat, a small, cowardly sound. "Susan, maybe," he started. But his voice trailed off as his wife shot him a look that could curdle milk. He shrank back into himself, his brief flicker of courage extinguished. He had always been like this, my son. A man made of water, always taking the shape of the strongest container he was poured into. Right now, that container was Susan.
"It's just..."
"Embarrassing, David," she said. Her voice now a conspiratorial whisper, as if I wasn't sitting right there. What if Mrs. Henderson next door hears her going on about spies and the Stasi? People talk. They'll think she's, you know. She didn't have to finish the sentence.
"Crazy."
Demented. Lost her mind. I had heard all the variations. Jake, emboldened by his mother's cruelty, leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Yeah, Grandma, seriously. It's not cool, it's just weird. You sound like a character from some old black and white movie nobody watches anymore." A black and white movie. That's what my life was to him. A flickering, irrelevant piece of fiction. He had no concept of the vibrant, terrifying colour of it all. He couldn't imagine the crimson of blood on fresh snow, or the stark, fearful grey of the Berlin Wall, or the acid green of the numbers on a primitive tracking device. To him, history was a boring subject in school, and the Cold War was something he'd seen in a video game. He couldn't grasp that I had lived it, that the consequences of my actions had been real and permanent. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up and tell them everything. I wanted to describe the smell of cheap schnapps on a contact's breath, the gut-wrenching terror of a checkpoint interrogation, the profound loneliness of living a life that was a complete fabrication. I wanted to tell them that the reason I had arthritis in my left hand was because it had been broken by an interrogator in a Prague basement. I wanted to tell them that the small, silvery scar above my eyebrow wasn't from a fall, but from a defector's desperate, flailing knife. But I said nothing. What was the point? They had already passed their verdict. I was a storyteller of tall tales, a purveyor of tedious fantasies. Anything I said would only be twisted into more evidence for their case against my sanity. So I sat in silence, my fingers growing numb around the cheap ceramic of the mug. I became the empty, quiet old woman they wanted me to be. The meal continued in a stilted, agonizing quiet. Forks scraped against plates. David chewed his food with a grim determination, his eyes fixed on the wall. Susan began a bright, brittle monologue about her garden club, her words like perfectly manicured little stones, dropped one by one into the silence to fill the void I had created. Jake and Chloe were completely absorbed in their digital worlds, their faces bathed in an ethereal glow, occasionally showing each other their screens and smirking. They were a family, a tight, exclusive little unit, and I was the outsider, a relic they were forced to house, a ghost at their feast. I was the price David paid for inheriting this house, the house my late husband, Robert, and I had built. They lived in my home, ate my food, and treated me like an intruder. I looked from face to face, my son, a stranger with my husband's eyes, my daughter-in-law, a woman whose ambition had curdled into a kind of casual cruelty, my grandson, a boy who saw my trauma as entertainment, my granddaughter, a girl so detached she was practically transparent. There was no love here, Not anymore. There was only obligation, resentment, and a weary, impatient waiting. Waiting for me to fade away completely. To become as silent and unobtrusive as the furniture. When dinner was finally over, Chloe was the first to bolt, mumbling something about homework. Jake followed, not even bothering with an excuse. David began clearing the plates with a frantic, nervous energy, avoiding my gaze. Susan stood, smoothing down her dress. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with false cheerfulness. "That was lovely. Happy birthday again, Lillian." She didn't look at me. She looked at the mug I was still clutching in my hands. "Do try to keep the stories to yourself, for everyone's sake." She walked away, her heels clicking decisively on the hardwood floor. I was left alone at the head of the table, in the echoing silence of the dining room. I stared at the mug, world's best grandma. It wasn't a gift. It was a judgment. It was a cage. It was their way of telling me who I was allowed to be. Slowly, deliberately, I loosened my grip. I placed the mug on the table, pushing it away from me. The story I had tried to tell surfaced again. Unbidden. The Berlin safe house, the gnawing hunger, the birthday I'd spent alone, humming a tune to myself, my hand resting on the cold steel of the pistol tucked into my waistband. I had been 25 years old, codenamed Nightingale, and I had been more alive in that frozen, dangerous room than I was here, in this warm, safe, perfect suburban house. There I had a purpose. I had a name, even if it was a secret one. Here, in the heart of my own family, in the year 2025, my existence had been reduced to a punchline. And as I sat there, the silence of the house pressing in on me, I realized that the worst prisons aren't made of concrete and steel. They're made of contempt. My name is Lillian Vance. I am 82 years old, and my world has shrunk to the size of this room. It's an attic, a space they converted after my husband, Robert, passed on. From my window, I can see the perfect emerald green lawns of neighbours, whose names I'll never learn, and the tops of cars that are always rushing somewhere important. When Robert's heart finally gave out, leaving a silence in our home that was louder than any storm, selling the house we'd built from the ground up seemed like the only sensible thing to do. David, my son, insisted. "It's too much for you, Mum," he'd said, his hand on my shoulder, his grip gentle but firm, the way one handles something fragile and old. And so, I moved in with him and his family. I told myself it would be a comfort to be surrounded by my own blood in the twilight of my life. I was wrong. It became a cage, beautifully decorated and softly furnished, but a cage nonetheless. I am a relic they are forced to polish, a piece of antique furniture that doesn't quite fit their modern decor. They think my mind is a flickering candle, guttering in the wind of old age. My stories, the ones that bubble up from the deep well of my past, they treat them as symptoms. Stories of cold nights in cities with names they can't pronounce, of silent signals passed in crowded train stations, of the weight of a secret that could collapse nations. To them, these are not memories. They are delusions. The sad, rambling fantasies of a woman whose grasp on reality has slipped. They smile patiently, a thin, strained smile that doesn't reach their eyes. Susan, my daughter-in-law, will pat my hand and say, "That's nice, dear," before changing the subject to something more palatable. like the rising cost of organic kale. They don't know. They can't know that these aren't fantasies. They're ghosts, fragmented, sharp-edged spectres that visit me in the quiet hours, demanding to be acknowledged. For 45 years, I was Mrs. Robert Vance. I was a wife, and then a mother. That was the life I chose, the life I poured my soul into. Robert was my anchor, my harbour. He was a good man, a kind man, with hands that knew how to fix anything from a leaky faucet to a broken heart. He smelled of sawdust and old spice, a scent that for decades meant home and safe. He never knew the whole truth of the woman I was before him. He knew I'd worked for the government, some vague clerical job overseas, he thought. He didn't need to know more. I wouldn't have burdened him with it. The life we built together was my reward, my peace treaty with the past. I packed away the other woman, the one they called Nightingale, into a dusty leather briefcase and put her in the back of a closet. I loved being a mother. When David was born, holding him in my arms felt more profound than any state secret I had ever protected. His small, trusting weight against my chest was real in a way the world of shadows and whispers never was. I baked cookies for his school events. I sewed patches on his jeans. I held his hand when he was sick and cheered the loudest at his little league games. I did it all with a quiet joy, a sense of profound gratitude for the simple, beautiful normality of it. This was my true mission, to build a life so ordinary, so safe, that the ghosts of Berlin and Prague could never find their way to our doorstep. I sacrificed the woman I was so that the woman I became could give my son a world without shadows. I never asked for anything in return. Seeing him happy, seeing him safe, that was the only payment I ever needed. Now, that boy is a man who looks at me with a tired sort of pity. His wife, Susan, sees me as a chore, another item on her endless to-do list. My grandchildren, Jake and Chloe, see a caricature, a crazy old lady who tells impossible stories. They don't understand that the freedoms they take for granted, the very bedrock of their safe, suburban lives, were paved with the choices I made in the dark. They don't see the sacrifice. They only see the inconvenience. And so I sit in my attic room and watch the world go by from my window, a prisoner of the very peace I fought so hard to create. Sometimes, in the quiet, my eyes drift to the corner of the room, to the empty space on the floor beside the old wardrobe. That's where it used to be, my leather briefcase. The one Susan decided was clutter during one of her cleansing purges. The feel of its worn handle is a phantom limb in my palm, the scent of old leather and paper, a ghost in the air. Just thinking of it is enough. The view from my window blurs, the tidy suburban street dissolving into a landscape of grey concrete and suspicion. The year is no longer 2025. The air grows cold, heavy with the smell of coal smoke and damp fear. It is 1968, and I am no longer Lillian Vance, the quiet grandmother, and my name is Nightingale. I am in East Berlin. The city is a wound that refuses to heal, stitched together with barbed wire and paranoia. I am wearing a simple woolen coat, my hair pulled back neatly. To any casual observer, I am a secretary, perhaps a librarian. Plain, Unforgettable. That is my camouflage. Beneath the coat, my heart is not beating. It is hammering, a frantic prisoner against my ribs. In my ear, so small it's almost undetectable, a tiny receiver crackles with the calm, disembodied voice of my handler, a man I know only as Control. His voice is a lifeline from another world, the only thing connecting me to reality. Target is approaching the fountain, north quadrant. He is holding the briefcase in his left hand. Acknowledge, Nightingale. I press a nearly invisible stud on the brooch pinned to my coat. A single, silent signal. Acknowledged. Fear is a living thing inside me. It has a taste like sucking on a copper penny. It's a metallic tang at the back of my throat that I have to swallow down again and again. My training taught me to control it, to wall it off, to function not in spite of it, but through it, to make it a tool. Fear keeps you sharp. Complacency gets you killed. My target is a mid-level Stasi officer. His name is Klaus Richter. I know more about him than his own wife does. I know he likes strudel, but not with raisins. I know he has a small gambling debt. I know he has a daughter with bright blue eyes, whose picture he keeps in his wallet. He is not a monster. He is a man, a cog in a monstrous machine. And that makes what I am about to do so much worse. He thinks he is meeting a contact who will help him with his debt. He has no idea that he is a pawn, and that I am the hand moving him across the board. The briefcase he carries contains reports, schedules, the names of informants. The briefcase I carry is identical in every detail. Same scuffs, same tarnished brass latches, but inside it holds nothing but carefully weighted paper and a state-of-the-art listening device, a bug that will turn his office into our ears. The plan is simple. A brush past, a moment of orchestrated confusion, a swap. Simple on paper. In reality, it is a ballet of 1,000 variables, any one of which could end with me in a windowless room in the bowels of the Stasi headquarters. He sits on the edge of the fountain, just as predicted. He lights a cigarette. I begin my approach, my steps measured, my gaze directed at a shop window across the square. I am just a woman on her way home. Control's voice is a murmur in my ear. Distraction in 5, 4, 3. Right on cue, a newspaper vendor a few yards away accidentally trips, sending a cascade of papers fluttering into the wind. It's enough. Heads turn. For a split second, Richter's eyes follow the motion. That is my window. I stumble, my ankle twisting unnaturally. I cry out, a small feminine sound of distress. I fall towards him, my briefcase swinging out. It collides with his. Both tumble to the ground. "Oh, I'm so terribly sorry," I gasp, my voice filled with convincing mortification. He is instantly on his feet, all German efficiency and politeness. "It is nothing, Fräulein. Are you all right?" His eyes are kind. He has no idea he is looking at his own ruin. As he helps me up, our hands brush. My fingers are ice, his are warm. In that single fluid motion, I grab his briefcase, and he grabs mine. The swap is made. It takes less than 2 seconds. "Thank you so much," I say, my voice trembling slightly for effect. He smiles, a genuine, unassuming smile. "Be more careful, Fräulein." And he walks away, carrying his betrayal in his left hand. The guilt is a physical weight, a stone in my stomach. I have just destroyed that man's life. For a file. for a whisper of information. I walk away, not too fast, not too slow. Every nerve is screaming. I feel 1,000 eyes on my back. I do not look back. I walk for 3 blocks, turn right, then left, following the escape route burned into my memory. Only when I am safely inside a designated safe house, the door locked and bolted behind me, do I allow my body to betray me. I lean against the door and slide to the floor, my legs unable to hold me. The briefcase sits on the floor beside me. I stare at it. It contains the hell I had to walk through, the compromises I had to make, the piece of my soul I had to trade away. And I am struck by a devastating thought, a realization that bridges the chasm of 57 years and hits me with the force of a physical blow right here in my attic room. These memories, this terror, this guilt, this is what my grandson Jake calls my boring fantasies. This is the hell I paid for, so that they could live their comfortable lives and find my past. Tedious. The floorboards beneath me seemed to grow thin in the evenings, becoming porous membranes through which the sounds of the house below would seep. I didn't need to press my ear to the wood to hear them. Their voices travelled up the narrow stairwell to my attic room with an unwelcome clarity. Laughter, sharp and brittle, from a television show I was not invited to watch. The clinking of ice in glasses, the scraping of cutlery on ceramic plates from which I ate separately, my own meals delivered on a plastic tray left on the top step, as if for an animal. One evening, the ambient noise was different. Lower, more conspiratorial. It was Susan's voice, a blade wrapped in silk. "We need to discuss it, David. Seriously this time." A pause. Then my son's voice, soft and yielding, the sound of a spine dissolving. "Susan, I don't know, it feels drastic." "What's drastic is having her wander off." Susan's voice rose, cutting through his hesitation. "What happens when she tells one of the neighbours her crazy stories about being a spy in Berlin? They'll think we're neglecting her. They'll think we're letting a senile old woman lose her mind. It's a liability, David. She is a liability." The word hung in the air between the floors. Liability. Not mother, not grandmother. A risk. A problem on a balance sheet. I sat on the edge of my cot, my own dinner cold and untouched on its tray. A dry sandwich and a cup of lukewarm water. They had a roast downstairs. I could smell the rosemary and garlic, a ghost of a family meal I was no longer a part of. "Her pension," Susan continued, her voice dropping again to that sharp whisper. "It would be so much easier to manage her finances if we had power of attorney. We could make sure she's provided for. Properly." I knew what provided for meant. It meant her manicured hands on my small monthly check, the last vestige of a life I had earned. The last piece of Robert's legacy that was mine and mine alone. They spoke of me as if I were a broken appliance, an old furnace that was costing them too much to run. I pictured them at the kitchen table, Susan leaning forward, her face earnest and predatory. David looking down at his hands, a portrait of cowardly compliance. He would mumble his agreement. He always did. He had traded his loyalties for a quiet life, and I was the price of his peace. I closed my eyes, the scent of rosemary replaced by the phantom smell of damp concrete and fear, a scent from a different lifetime that felt more real than this attic room. The cruelty, I learned, could always find a new, more inventive form. The chill from that overheard conversation never quite left the attic, but it was soon eclipsed by a betrayal so modern, so casually vicious, it left me breathless. It came from Jake. My grandson had started to seek me out, At first, I felt a flicker of hope. He would sit on the dusty trunk at the foot of my bed, his phone held loosely in his hand, and ask me questions. "So, Grandma," he'd begin, a strange, manufactured interest in his eyes. "Tell me again about that time in the jungle, the one with the ambush." I, a fool starved for connection, would oblige. I would close my eyes and let the memories surface, fragmented and sharp-edged. I spoke of the oppressive humidity of a Southeast Asian night, the metallic taste of adrenaline, the face of a young man from my unit, a boy from Ohio named Miller, who I saw fall. The words were difficult, dredged up from a place of deep pain I had kept locked away for decades. I spoke of loss, of the terrible weight of survival, and Jake would nod, his thumb swiping intermittently across his phone screen. "Wow, that's crazy, Grandma. Really wild." The discovery came by accident. I had ventured downstairs to get a glass of water, a journey I made as seldom as possible. The living room was dark, save for the pulsing blue light of a phone. I heard giggling, not just Jake, but his sister Chloe and a few of their friends. They were huddled together on the sofa that my back was no longer permitted to touch. Curiosity, a dangerous and long dormant instinct, pulled me closer. I stayed in the shadows of the hallway, peering around the doorframe. On the small screen, I saw my own face. It was filmed in the grainy light of my attic room. But my voice, when it came, was warped. And as I spoke of Miller's last moments, a popular, upbeat pop song blared over my words. A filter had been placed over my face, giving me giant, weeping, cartoon eyes and a ridiculously oversized, downturned mouth. The video ended, and another began. Me describing the terror of a checkpoint in Prague. My pained recollection now set to a funny sound clip of a screeching cat. The series had a title, displayed in bold, cheerful letters at the top of the screen. Grandma's Cold War Delusions. The teenagers roared with laughter. "Dude, the one where she talks about the cyanide pill is the best." One of his friends choked out, wiping tears of mirth from his eyes. "You have to post that one next." Jake, my grandson, preened under the praise. "I'm telling you, she's a content goldmine." Chloe looked up and for a brief second, her eyes met mine in the darkness. I saw a flicker of something, shame, perhaps, or pity, but it was extinguished as quickly as it appeared. She looked away, back at the screen, and offered a weak, complicit giggle. My trauma, my life's secret silent burden, the ghosts I carried every single day. They had been repackaged, edited, and set to music for the amusement of children who thought history was a boring subject in school. The laughter from the living room wasn't just sound. It felt physical, like shrapnel tearing through the thin walls of my chest, lodging itself in my heart. I backed away, my hand over my mouth to stifle the sound that threatened to escape. I made my way back up the stairs, each step a monumental effort. In my room, I didn't turn on the light. I just sat in the darkness. The phantom glow of that phone screen burned onto the inside of my eyelids. I was not a person to them. I was not even a liability anymore. I was content. The final violation came a few weeks later, under the guise of spring cleaning. Susan announced it as if she were a general declaring a new campaign. "This whole house needs a deep clean, starting with the attic. It's a fire hazard up there." She didn't ask for my permission. She simply appeared at my door one morning, clad in rubber gloves, brandishing a roll of black trash bags. Chloe and Jake were with her, their expressions a mixture of sullen reluctance and morbid curiosity. They were my guards, there to make sure I didn't interfere. "We're just going to get rid of some of this old junk, Lillian," Susan said, her voice offensively bright. She didn't look at me, but at the meagre collection of my life's possessions. "It will feel so much better when it's all clean and organized." I stood silently in the corner, a prisoner in my own small space, as they moved through my room. They tossed old paperbacks, a threadbare shawl Robert had given me, a small collection of nesting dolls I'd bought in Moscow. Each item thrown into a black bag was a small death. Then Susan's eyes landed on the old, worn leather satchel I kept under the cot. My breath caught in my throat. She pulled it out, holding it by a corner between her thumb and forefinger as if it were contaminated. "Good Lord, what is this?" She wrinkled her nose. "This old thing is disgusting. It smells of mothballs and decay." "Don't." The word was a dry rasp, barely audible. She ignored me. She unbuckled the stiff leather straps and tipped its contents onto the floor. My service medals, tarnished but heavy with meaning, clattered onto the dusty floorboards. A faded black and white photograph of my unit, 7 young faces full of grim purpose, only 2 of whom saw the end of the war, slid under the bed. And last, a small porcelain object rolled out. It looked like a tooth, a fake molar. Jake bent down to pick it up. "Whoa, cool, what's this?" Before I could answer, Susan snatched it from his hand. "Don't touch that, it's probably covered in germs. It's all trash." Inside that tooth, nestled in a hollowed-out compartment, was a tiny, dark capsule. Cyanide, a souvenir from a world where the choice between capture and death had to be immediate. It was the most honest object I owned. It was the truth of what I had been. "No," I said again, my voice a little stronger this time. "That is mine." Susan looked at me then, her eyes cold and dismissive. It was the look one gives a toddler having a tantrum over a broken toy. "Lillian, be reasonable. It's junk. We're doing you a favor." With a single sweeping motion of her arm, she scraped the medals, the photograph, and the fake tooth into the gaping mouth of the black trash bag. She twisted the top, tied a knot, and handed it to Jake. "Take this out to the bin with the rest of it." I watched him carry my life out of the room. I watched Susan dust her hands off with a look of profound satisfaction. I said nothing else. The Nightingale in me, the woman who had been trained to absorb pain and show no reaction, took over. I became a statue of silent compliance. They saw it as surrender. It was a declaration of war. That night, I waited. I waited until the house was silent, until the rhythmic breathing of my captors filled the rooms below. I crept down the stairs, each step a calculated risk. The back door was locked, but the lock was old and simple, a trick I'd learned in a safe house in Vienna 50 years ago, worked as well now as it did then. A hairpin, a little pressure, a soft click. The night air was cold against my thin nightgown. The moon was a sliver, casting long, distorted shadows across the lawn. The trash bins stood by the curb, grim sentinels waiting for the morning collection. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and fury. I lifted the heavy lid of the bin marked for general waste. The stench of coffee grounds and rotting food filled my nostrils. I plunged my hands in. The plastic was cold and slick with condensation and something I didn't want to identify. I ignored the revulsion. I was Nightingale. I had waded through sewers in Budapest. I had hidden in dumpsters in Warsaw. This was nothing. My fingers, wrinkled and stiff with age, searched through the filth. I felt the sharp edge of a discarded can, the soft, wet mass of a paper towel, the grimy surface of a plastic container. And then I felt it. The familiar rough texture of the leather satchel, I pulled it free. It was stained and smelled foul, but it was all there. I didn't check the contents. I knew they were inside. Clutching it to my chest like a lost child, I stole back into the house, locking the door behind me. Back in my attic room, under the faint moonlight, I cleaned each item with a cloth dampened with my drinking water. The medals, the photograph of my ghosts, the cyanide tooth. I held them in my hands, their cold, hard reality, a comfort. Cold plastic of the trash bag against my fingers was no colder than the resolve forming in my soul. A resolve that had been forged in the crucible of that bin. They had looked at my life, at my history, at my very essence, and declared it to be garbage. They had thrown me away. I placed the items back in the satchel and hid it deep within the wall cavity behind a loose floorboard. As I did, a profound calm settled over me. The desperation was gone, burned away by the white-hot certainty of my next move. They had built this cage of contempt and cruelty around me, piece by piece. They thought I was broken. They were wrong. I was being remade. They had thrown me away. Now I would do the same to them. The silence of that Tuesday morning was a thick, heavy blanket, the kind my mother used to say was good for sleeping in. But I was not asleep. I was watching a sparrow on the windowsill, its tiny head cocked as it debated the merits of a crumb I'd left for it. The house beneath me hummed with its usual rhythm of resentment. The low murmur of the television from the living room, where David was likely watching some mindless game show. The clatter of dishes in the sink, a percussive anger from Susan, who felt every chore done for me was a personal injustice. This was my life now, a collection of sounds I was meant to ignore, a presence I was meant to minimize. Then, a new sound cut through the familiar drone. It was the whisper of expensive tires on asphalt, a sound so out of place in our modest suburban street that even the sparrow on the sill froze and took flight. I moved from my chair, my joints protesting, and peered through the grimy pane of my attic window. A car, long and black as a spill of ink, was parked at our curb. It wasn't just a car, it was a statement. It was the kind of vehicle that doesn't just transport people, but announces their arrival. The polished chrome gleamed even in the overcast light, a silent rebuke to the peeling paint on our neighbour's fence and the faded plastic flamingo on our lawn. A man emerged from the driver's side. He was tall and slender, encased in a suit of charcoal grey, so perfectly tailored it seemed less like clothing and more like a second skin. He moved with an economy of motion I hadn't seen in decades, a kind of fluid purpose that belongs to men who never have to second-guess their next step. He smoothed his suit jacket, not out of nervousness, but as a final, precise check before beginning an operation. He walked up our cracked concrete path, his polished leather shoes making no sound. I heard the doorbell chime, a sharp, interrogative sound that sent a jolt through the house. I heard Susan's heavy sigh, the sound of her wiping her hands on her apron. The front door opened with a familiar squeak. I couldn't see them from my vantage point, but I could hear. And I had learned long ago that listening was more revealing than seeing. "Can I help you?" Susan's voice was clipped, impatient, the voice she used for door-to-door salesmen and religious proselytizers. "Good morning." The man's voice was a low, calm baritone, cultivated. English. "My name is Alistair Finch. I have an appointment." "An appointment with who? We're not expecting anyone." There was a beat of silence, I could picture him standing there, his gaze steady, unbothered by her hostility. I believe I do. I'm here for Nightingale. The name. He said the name. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't emphasized, but it landed in the quiet hallway of my son's house like a grenade. Downstairs, there was only silence. A thick, confused silence from Susan. But up here, in my attic room, the name detonated a chain reaction of memories. Berlin, the scent of wet cobblestones and cheap coal smoke. The weight of a Beretta in my coat pocket. The face of a young man I once knew as Sparrow, just before he jumped from a bridge. Nightingale, a name I had buried under 60 years of marriage, motherhood, and the quiet, crushing weight of a normal life. A name that did not belong here in this house of beige carpets and bitter regrets. I pressed my hand against the wall to steady myself, my breath catching in my throat. Nightingale? Susan finally choked out, her voice a mixture of disbelief and ridicule. You've got the wrong house, buddy. There's no Nightingale here, just my mother-in-law, and believe me, she's no songbird. I assure you I have the correct address. Finch's voice remained unnervingly level. I am not here for Lillian Vance. I am here for Nightingale. It is a matter of some urgency. Oh, for heaven's sake. Susan's scoff was a sharp, ugly sound. She's done it again, another one of her imaginary friends. Look, mister, I don't know what kind of game you're playing or what she's told you, but my mother-in-law is unwell. She gets confused, she tells stories. I'm well aware of the stories she tells, Finch said. And for the first time I detected a sliver of ice in his tone. I am here because a sensitive file was inadvertently included in a recent declassification. Her file. It's a matter of national and personal security. Now, may I please speak with her? The front door slammed shut. I didn't need to see it to know. It was Susan's final, punctuating statement in any argument. I heard her stomping back toward the kitchen, muttering under her breath. National security, the nerve. Just another con man trying to get at her pension. I sank back into my worn armchair, the springs groaning in protest. The world outside the window seemed to fade. The name echoed in the small room, Nightingale. They had found me. After all these years, after I had painstakingly constructed the camouflage of a frail, forgotten old woman, they had found me. And a part of me, a dark, cold part I had kept locked away, felt a terrifying thrill. The game, it seemed, was not over. The cage my family had been constructing for years, woven from condescension and casual cruelty, suddenly became tangible, its bars forged in law offices and sealed with court orders. Susan's fear, ignited by Alistair Finch's visit, was a potent catalyst. She saw him not as a government official, but as a predator, a sophisticated scam artist looking to swindle a confused old woman out of her meagre savings. The irony was so thick, it was suffocating. They, who had been systematically siphoning my pension for years to cover their own poor financial decisions, were now positioning themselves as my protectors against an imaginary threat. The first salvo came 2 days after the black sedan disappeared from our street. It was a thick, cream-coloured envelope delivered by a courier who required a signature. David signed for it, his brow furrowed with a manufactured concern that made my stomach turn. He and Susan opened it at the kitchen table, their heads bent together in a conspiratorial huddle. I watched, from the top of the stairs, a ghost in my own home. I didn't need to read the document to know what it was. I could see it in the grim satisfaction on Susan's face, in the way David's shoulders slumped with a false sense of tragic duty. Later that evening, after they thought I was asleep, I crept downstairs. The envelope lay on the counter, discarded. I pulled out the sheaf of papers. The legal jargon was dense, intentionally obfuscating, but the words leaped out at me like hostile soldiers from an ambush. Emergency petition for conservatorship in the matter of Lillian Vance. Lacks capacity to make decisions, a danger to herself and her assets, susceptible to undue influence. And there, listed under exhibits, was the final, brutal betrayal. Exhibit A. A series of video recordings publicly available on the social media platform TikTok demonstrating cognitive decline, paranoid delusions, and a detachment from reality. My grandson's videos, my fragmented, painful memories, chopped up and remixed with laugh tracks and stupid filters, were now being presented to a court as clinical evidence of my incompetence. The story of my first mission in Berlin, the one where I'd felt the cold sweat of fear and the bitter taste of moral compromise, that was now evidence of a paranoid delusion. The memory of the codename list I'd had to memorize and then burn, the ashes stinging my eyes, that was proof of a detachment from reality. Jake had not just mocked my past, he had weaponized it against me. He had handed his parents the gun, and they were pointing it directly at my head, calling it an act of love. They were building my cage and calling it protection. They saw Finch as the wolf at the door, but they were the ones who had been devouring me from the inside out for years. This petition wasn't about protecting me. It was about control. It was about legally seizing what little I had before this mysterious, well-dressed stranger could get his hands on it. It was about silencing me for good, transforming their narrative of the senile old woman into a legally binding reality. I placed the papers back on the counter, my hands steady. The rage I felt was not hot and explosive. It was cold, clean, and clarifying, like a shard of ice pressed against my heart. They had made their move. They had laid their trap. They assumed I was a helpless old woman, a pawn in a game I didn't even know was being played. They had forgotten who I was, or rather, they had never believed it in the first place. Mr. Finch found a way to contact me. It was clever, a simple but effective piece of tradecraft that stirred a dormant part of my brain. A pamphlet for a local lawn care service appeared in our mailbox, addressed to me. Tucked inside was not a coupon for fertilizer, but a small folded note. The paper was thin, almost translucent. An admirer of your azaleas wishes to meet. The greenhouse at Northwood Park. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. There were no azaleas in our yard. Robert had always preferred roses. It was a test, a small, simple one. He needed to know if the woman he was dealing with was Lillian Vance or Nightingale. The next morning I told Susan I was feeling faint and needed some fresh air. She looked at me with a new kind of scrutiny, her eyes narrowed, searching for signs of further decay or perhaps a burgeoning conspiracy. "Don't wander off," she said, her voice sharp, "and be back in an hour. We have that appointment with Dr. Matthews, remember? The one the lawyer set up." The appointment was a psychiatric evaluation, another brick in the wall of their conservatorship case. I nodded meekly and shuffled out the back door. The greenhouse was warm and humid, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming orchids. Alistair Finch was standing by a display of carnivorous plants, examining a pitcher plant with detached curiosity. He wore a tweed jacket and trousers, blending in with the few other elderly patrons wandering the aisles. He didn't look at me as I approached. "Robert's security protocols were always excessive," he said, his voice a low murmur that didn't carry past the Venus flytraps. "But in this instance, perhaps they were prudent. What do you want, Finch? I kept my voice just as low. He finally turned to face me. His eyes were a pale, intelligent blue. To help you. Your family has expedited the timeline. Their petition for conservatorship complicates matters significantly. They think you're a con man trying to steal my pension, I said, a humorless smile touching my lips. A reasonable assumption, given the circumstances, he conceded, but a deeply inaccurate one. Your finances, Lillian, are not limited to your government pension. He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle in the humid air. When you and your husband retired from the service, it wasn't with a simple handshake and a thank you. The agency doesn't work that way for assets like you. You were compensated, generously. There is a confidential trust managed by a Swiss entity set up in both your names. It is substantial. I stared at him, the scent of the orchids suddenly cloying, overwhelming. A trust, money. It seemed so vulgar, so disconnected from the reality of my attic room and Susan's constant complaints about the grocery bills. Robert never told me. It was part of the arrangement, plausible deniability. The funds were to remain untouched, growing, until one of you passed. Upon Robert's death, control was to transfer entirely to you. Finch's expression became grave. However, there is a complication, a second obstacle. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim file. He opened it to a page marked with a red tab. Robert was a good man, Lillian, and he loved you, but he was also a pragmatist. He lived with you for 40 years after Berlin. He saw the nightmares. He understood the lingering effects of your service, your PTSD. I flinched. The clinical term felt like a brand. He was afraid, Finch continued gently. Afraid that the trauma, combined with the sudden access to a vast fortune, might lead you to self-destructive behavior. He wanted to protect you, not just from others, but from yourself. He turned the file so I could read the highlighted text. It was a clause written in dense legalese, but its meaning was brutally clear. In the event of any question regarding the beneficiary's mental state or capacity, full unilateral control of the trust and its assets shall be withheld until such time as the beneficiary, Lillian Vance, is formally declared to be of sound mind and mentally competent by a recognized legal or judicial panel. I felt the air leave my lungs. A cold dread, far deeper than the fear of Susan's cruelty, washed over me. Robert. My Robert, my anchor, my safe harbour, the man who held me when I woke up screaming about the snow in Prague. In his desperate, loving attempt to build a shield around me, he had instead forged the very weapon my family now needed to destroy me. He had handed them the key to my cage. Susan and David didn't need to prove I was a danger to myself to a criminal court. They just had to introduce enough doubt, enough questions regarding my mental state, to a probate judge. They could use Jake's videos, their fabricated stories, the testimony of a hired psychiatrist, to block my access to the one thing that could grant me freedom. They could lock me away from my own life, my own resources, all under the guise of fulfilling my late husband's loving wishes. The cage wasn't just built of their greed, it was reinforced with Robert's fear. It was the most perfect, inescapable trap I could have ever imagined. I walked back from the park in a daze, the world muted and grey. The legal petition, Robert's well-intentioned but catastrophic clause, these were external obstacles, tactical problems to be solved. But as I climbed the stairs to my attic prison, I understood that the tallest, most formidable wall I had to scale was not in a courtroom or a Swiss bank. It was inside me. To fight them, to dismantle the cage they were so proudly constructing, I couldn't be Lillian Vance, the quiet widow, the doddering grandmother they had created. Lillian Vance was their victim, a character in their sad little play. She was weak, forgettable, and, according to them, delusional. To win, I had to become someone else. I had to resurrect a ghost. To fight back meant embracing the identity of Nightingale. And my soul recoiled from the thought. I had spent more than half a century trying to bury her. Nightingale wasn't a hero. She wasn't the valiant figure from some patriotic film. She was a weapon, honed by the agency to be precise, effective, and unburdened by conscience. Her currency was secrets and lies. Her tools were manipulation and, when necessary, betrayal. She could smile at a man while calculating the most efficient way to ruin his life. She could comfort a weeping informant, her voice full of false sympathy, moments before leaving him to his fate. She had altered lives. She had ended them. The morality of her actions was a luxury I could never afford. Each act was a small, necessary sin in service of a greater, hazier good. But the sins didn't just vanish. They settled in your bones, a cold, heavy sediment that never went away. Becoming Nightingale again meant willingly walking back into that moral midnight. It meant looking at my own family, at David, my son, at Jake, my grandson, not with the wounded heart of a mother and grandmother, but with the cold, calculating eyes of an operative assessing a target. It meant identifying their weaknesses, their fears, their pressure points, and exploiting them without mercy. It meant treating their lives as a series of variables in an equation of my own survival. Could I do that? Could I look at the boy who used to fall asleep in my lap and see him only as an adversary to be neutralized? Could I look at my son, the baby I had rocked to sleep, and see him as collateral damage? The greatest obstacle was me. It was the part of me that had loved them, the part that still, foolishly, felt the sting of their betrayal as a personal wound rather than a strategic attack. To win, that part of me would have to go silent, the warmth would have to be extinguished, replaced by a cold, functional clarity. I sat in my chair and picked up Jake's old, discarded smartphone, the one he'd left in my room months ago. I had seen him using it to film me, his face alight with smug amusement. Now I stared at my reflection in its dark, silent screen. A frail old woman stared back. Her face was a roadmap of 82 years, her skin thin as paper, her eyes clouded with a weariness that felt ancient. This was Lillian Vance. This was the woman they were trying to put in a cage. She looked tired. She looked defeated. But I kept staring. I looked deeper, past the wrinkles and the age spots, into the pupils. And behind the reflection of the tired old woman, I saw a flicker of something else, a shadow moving in the depths. The shadow had no wrinkles. It had no fear. Its eyes were not weary. They were sharp, focused, and utterly, terrifyingly cold. They were the eyes that had watched a man fall from the Glenacher Bridge without flinching. They were the eyes that had identified a double agent across a crowded ballroom from the subtle tremor in his hand. The shadow nodded, a slow, deliberate confirmation from a place beyond time and grief. The choice was made. The internal war was over. Lillian Vance, the grandmother, could weep later. Nightingale had work to do. Yes, I could. The lawyer Susan had hired spoke to me over the phone, his voice a slick, condescending drone that David held up to my ear. He spoke about legal processes, about evaluations and best interests. Words designed to sound caring while they were, in fact, the verbal architecture of a cage. Susan watched me, her arms crossed, a little smirk playing on her lips. She was waiting for me to launch into a story about a double agent in Budapest or a dead drop in the Tiergarten. She was waiting for the senile old woman to perform her part. I listened to the lawyer's entire monologue. When he finally paused, expecting an outburst, I did nothing. I simply looked at the phone in David's hand, then at Susan, and I gave a single, slow, deliberate nod. The silence that followed was more profound than any sound I could have made. It was a vacuum, and it pulled all the air out of the room. David shifted uncomfortably. Susan's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. This wasn't in their script. A rambling protest they could handle, a tearful plea they could dismiss. But quiet, simple, lucid agreement? It was a language they didn't understand. From that moment on, I stopped speaking of the past. The stories of Berlin, the whispers of Prague, the ghosts of my former life, they all retreated. I packed them away as neatly as I had once packed my field kit, sealing them behind a wall of placid silence. I became what they had always accused me of being, or rather, the empty vessel they wished I was. In the mornings, I would come down for breakfast and sit at the small corner table they had designated for me. Susan would ask, with a voice dripping in false solicitude, "Did you sleep well, Lillian?" I would nod, perhaps offer a small, thin smile, and then focus on buttering my toast. "No dreams about being a secret agent last night?" Jake would snicker from across the table, his eyes glued to his phone. I wouldn't even look at him. I would simply take a bite of toast, chew slowly, and look out the window at the maple tree in the yard. My silence was a mirror. In it, they could no longer see the caricature of a crazy old woman they had created. Instead, they saw only themselves, their cruelty and mockery reflected back at them, with no distraction. My lack of response made their taunts hang in the air, naked and ugly. They saw it as a victory, at first, a surrender. "I think the reality of the hearing is finally sinking in," I heard Susan whisper to David in the hallway one evening. "She's finally given up the fantasy." I sat in my attic room, the door slightly ajar, listening. I wasn't a ghost haunting them. I was a field agent on a long-term surveillance mission. I was observing their patterns, their weaknesses, their tells. David's nervous habit of jingling the change in his pocket when he was lying. Susan's obsessive need for control and external validation. Her constant scrolling through social media, her face tightening at any perceived slight. Jake's lazy, entitled arrogance, a boy who had never faced a real consequence in his life. Chloe's quiet complicity, her unease masked by a desperate desire to fit in with the family's casual cruelty. They thought they were winning. They thought my silence was the white flag of a defeated mind. They were wrong. Every quiet nod, every serene smile, every moment I refused to give them the reaction they craved was a sharpening of the blade. They had pushed and pushed, expecting me to shatter. They never considered that I might instead compress, hardening under the pressure until I was something sharp enough to cut. This wasn't my surrender. This was my declaration of war.
The first move had to be silent, untraceable. Alistair Finch understood this implicitly. There was no clandestine meeting in a foggy park. He was far too sophisticated for that. The package arrived via a high-end grocery delivery service I knew Susan used.
Tucked at the bottom of a bag, beneath organic kale and artisanal cheese, was a small, plain white box, meant for macarons. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was not a sweet confection, but a sleek, black burner phone, fully charged, and a prepaid debit card. It was elegant. It was deniable. It was perfect. That evening, as Susan preened about the bargain she'd gotten on imported olive oil, I held the small, cold weight of the phone in my pocket. It felt like an old friend. My war room was now the size of my palm. My first target was Susan's carefully constructed facade of suburban perfection. Her battlefield was social media, specifically the Maple Creek Moms Facebook group, a digital viper's nest of competitive parenting, passive aggression, and thinly veiled gossip. I spent 2 days just observing, learning the vernacular, the cadence of the posts, the key players. Then, using the burner phone's data plan and an anonymous profile I named Observer82, I planted the first seed. The post was a masterpiece of plausible deniability. I didn't mention the Vances by name. I didn't even mention our street. Just a general question for the group, I typed, my old fingers surprisingly nimble on the touchscreen. Has anyone else felt the financial pressure lately? It's just, I see some families around town with new cars and designer bags, and I hear whispers that it's all built on a mountain of credit card debt. Makes you worry about the whole community, doesn't it? Hope everyone is being smart and living within their means. I hit post and leaned back, a cold sense of satisfaction settling over me. It was a social IED. The explosion wouldn't be loud, but the shrapnel would be devastating. Within an hour, the comments started. OMG, so true. I was just thinking this. I know exactly who you're talking about, Observer82. It's the ones who post the most about their #blessed life that you have to watch out for. That night, the tension in the house was a physical thing. Susan was glued to her phone, her thumb scrolling frantically. Her face was pale. David, she hissed, her voice a low, sharp thing. Come here. Look at this. I heard his footsteps, then his dismissive grunt. It's a vague post, Susan. It could be about anyone. Don't you see the comments? She snapped. Linda from down the street liked it. So did Maria from Chloe's dance class. They're talking about us. They know. How do they know about the Visa card? Their whispers were my victory music. I had bypassed the locks on their doors and the alarm system. I had slipped past their defenses and planted a listening device directly inside Susan's own paranoia. Next came the physical campaign. Operation Gaslight, I called it in my head. It was child's play compared to the psychological operations we ran in the Eastern Bloc, but the principles were the same. Disrupt the target's reality. Make them question their own senses. Make them feel like they are losing their mind. It started with the keys. Susan was pathologically organized. Her car keys went on a specific hook by the door every single time. The morning of her big PTA fundraising meeting, the keys were not on the hook. David, have you seen my keys? Her voice was already frayed. On the hook, where they always are, he called back from the living room. No, they're not. I sat at my corner table, calmly sipping my tea, watching the performance. The night before, after they had gone to bed, I had slipped downstairs. The house was a different entity at night, a sleeping beast. I knew its every creak, its every shadow. I took her keys from the hook and gently placed them inside a large, ornate vase on the hall table. A vase she dusted every week, but never looked inside. The frantic search lasted for 20 minutes. Accusations flew. Did you move them? You're always misplacing things. I never touch your keys. They turned out drawers, checked coat pockets, their mutual irritation escalating with every passing second. Finally, in a fit of frustration, Susan slammed her hand on the hall table, rattling the vase. The faint jingle of keys was unmistakable. She peered inside, her expression a mixture of relief and utter confusion. How did they get in there? She murmured, looking around the empty hallway as if expecting an answer. Her eyes flicked toward me for a second, but I was just a harmless old woman reading the paper, oblivious. The seed of doubt, however, had been planted. The house was no longer her perfectly controlled sanctuary. It was becoming unpredictable. Then came the thermostat, a petty battlefield, but an effective one. David liked the house at a brisk 68 degrees. Susan preferred a cosier 72. Their bickering over it was a constant, low-grade hum in the house. Using the skills I'd learned to move silently through booby-trapped buildings, I would adjust it in the dead of night. Just 1 or 2 degrees. Enough to be noticed, not enough to be certain. "Did you turn up the heat again?" David would grumble in the morning. "No, I'm freezing. I thought you turned it down," Susan would retort. They would glare at each other over their coffee, another small crack appearing in the foundation of their marriage. The masterstroke, however, was the baby monitor. It was Susan's favourite tool of surveillance, the one she kept in my room ostensibly to make sure you're okay at night. In reality, it was a one-way radio broadcasting my every cough and sigh directly to her bedside table. It was time to broadcast something back. I still had a few tricks from the old days. I knew how to create auditory illusions, how to use the specific acoustics of a room to my advantage. One night, when the wind was blowing just right, rattling the window frame, I positioned myself in the corner of my room, furthest from the monitor's microphone. I didn't speak, I just whispered, letting the sounds blend with the wind. "So much debt." It was barely audible, a phantom on the edge of hearing. "Lose everything." I heard a sharp gasp from downstairs, followed by the frantic sound of Susan turning the volume up. I stayed silent. She would tell herself it was just the wind, just static. But the words were already in her head. The next night I did it again. This time I mimicked the faint, reedy voice of a collection agent. "Final notice, Mrs. Vance." The following morning, Susan looked like she hadn't slept at all. There were dark circles under her eyes. She snapped at Chloe for spilling a drop of milk. She accused David of hiding bills from her. Her composure, her one great armour, was not just cracking, it was beginning to shatter. She was being haunted, and the terrifying part for her was that the ghost was coming from inside her own house. I watched it all, my face a mask of gentle, vacant concern. Inside, the Nightingale was taking flight. The internal war was weakening their fortress, but to win, I needed an outside force. I needed to bring in the heavy artillery. I needed a storyteller, someone who could take the truth and make the entire world listen. I remembered Daniel Petrov. He wasn't a contact from my official files. He was a ghost from my personal history. Vienna, 1975. He was a young, hungry cub reporter for an international newswire, all sharp elbows and sharper questions. I was undercover as a cultural attaché's assistant. He'd nearly stumbled onto one of my operations, a delicate asset extraction. I had personally and carefully fed him a piece of disinformation that sent him chasing a phantom scandal for 3 weeks, giving my team the time we needed. He never knew it was me. He just knew his big break had evaporated into thin air. He had hated that anonymous source, but I knew he respected the skill of the misdirection. He was smart, he was relentless, and now, decades later, he was a Pulitzer-winning investigative journalist, a man who specialized in pulling down powerful people by exposing their buried secrets. Using the burner phone and the encrypted browser Finch had installed, I found his professional contact page. It listed a secure encrypted email address for sensitive tips. It was time to light a fuse that would burn all the way from my attic room to the front page of a national newspaper. My hands were steady as I typed. I couldn't afford to sound like a crank. The message had to be concise, factual, and utterly irresistible to a man like him. Subject: Vienna, 1975. You chased a ghost. I can give you a real one. Mr. Petrov, you will not remember me, but I remember you. I was the one who led you away from the truth about the Soviet trade attaché's defection. That was a misdirection to cover a black operation, codenamed Operation Winter Sun. The official record states the operation was a failure, resulting in the regrettable loss of 3 Allied assets in East Germany. This is a lie. The operation was a success. 1 asset was extracted, 2 were deliberately sacrificed to protect a higher value source inside the Stasi. I know this because I was the asset who was extracted. I am the Nightingale. I am sure you are skeptical. You should be. So here are 3 facts you can verify through back channels and declassified, though heavily redacted, archives. 1. Check the flight manifest for Pan Am Flight 73 out of Tempelhof Airport on December 8, 1972. Look for a passenger named Anneliese Schmidt. She did not exist. 2. Cross-reference the autopsy report of a low-level MI6 clerk named Thomas Brewer, who died of a heart attack in London a week later. The toxicology report was buried. He was poisoned with a derivative of ricin. 3. Search for any mention of a Stasi Major Klaus Richter after December 1972. You will find nothing. He didn't just disappear. He was erased. These are just the footnotes. I have the full story. A story of heroism, betrayal, and a government that buried its heroes to protect its secrets. It's a story that certain powerful people, even today, want to remain dead. I am not asking for money. I am asking for the truth to be told. If you are the journalist I remember, this will be enough to make you start digging. I did not sign my name. I simply sent the email from the anonymous account and wiped the browser history. The bait was set. For days, I heard nothing. The silence from the outside world was as heavy as the silence I was imposing inside the house. I began to wonder if I had misjudged him. Perhaps the hungry reporter from Vienna was gone, replaced by a comfortable, complacent man who no longer had the appetite for a fight. The gaslighting campaign continued. I moved David's favourite golf trophy from the mantelpiece to the top of the refrigerator. I switched the sugar and salt shakers. Small, petty acts of psychological warfare that kept Susan and David in a state of low-grade, simmering chaos. Susan's paranoia was now a constant companion. She would stop in doorways, looking around as if she could catch the house in the act of betraying her. She accused Chloe of playing tricks on her. She told David she thought the house was unsettling. Then, one afternoon, Finch made a pre-arranged call to the house landline. It was a simple, coded message. Lillian, Alistair here. Just calling to say I enjoyed that documentary we discussed, the one about the Arctic expedition. The research was impeccable. Arctic expedition, Winter Sun, impeccable research. Petrov was digging. A new energy filled me. It was the old feeling, the hum of an operation in motion. The pieces were moving on the board, following the trail of breadcrumbs I had left him. He wouldn't know he was being guided. He would believe it was his own brilliant investigative work, his own instincts leading him to the truth. And in a way it was. I had simply pointed his instincts in the right direction. I had weaponized his ambition and his integrity. The world outside my attic window seemed sharper, the colors more vivid. The end was not yet in sight, but the path to it was becoming clear. They thought they had trapped me in their world of petty cruelties and mundane concerns. They had no idea I was about to drag them into mine, a world of consequences, of secrets, of a truth so heavy it could crush them all. The world would soon know about Operation Winter Sun, and in doing so, they would learn the truth about Lillian Vance, a truth my own family refused to see, whether they wanted to or not. The conference room was the colour of bone and smelled of industrial cleaner and quiet desperation. It was a space designed to strip away emotion, to reduce lives to bullet points and legal statutes. On one side of the polished mahogany table sat my family. Susan, my daughter-in-law, wore a mask of concerned solemnity, a performance for the panel. Her hand rested on my son David's arm, a gesture meant to convey solidarity, but which I recognized as a gesture of ownership. David wouldn't meet my eye. He stared at a knot in the wood grain of the table, as if it held the secrets to the universe, his face pale and clammy. And then there was Jake. My grandson sat slumped in his chair, radiating a smug boredom. He was the architect of this particular humiliation, and he wore his achievement like a varsity letter jacket. Their lawyer, a man named Mr. Davies, with a smile as synthetic as the carpet, stood before the three-person panel. "Your Honour, members of the panel," he began, his voice a smooth, reasonable baritone. "We are here today not out of malice, but out of profound concern for the well-being of Lillian Vance." I remained still, my hands folded in my lap. I had dressed carefully that morning in a simple grey suit, the fabric old but immaculate. My hair was pulled back in a severe bun. I was a portrait of a respectable, harmless old woman. It was the perfect camouflage. "Mrs. Vance," Davis continued, gesturing toward me with a soft, pitying hand, "has in recent years retreated into a world of her own making, a world of fantasy, of grandiose and often disturbing delusions." He turned to the large monitor on the wall. "The most compelling evidence of Mrs. Vance's cognitive decline and detachment from reality, unfortunately, comes from her own words, as documented by her grandson, Jake." Jake straightened up, a flicker of pride in his eyes. On the screen, the first TikTok appeared. It was me, sitting in the armchair in my attic room, the afternoon light casting long shadows across my face. The audio was a mashup of my voice, clipped and confused, set to a trending, upbeat pop song. "They called me Nightingale," my distorted voice said, followed by a cartoon sound effect of a bird chirping. The video cut to a close-up of my hands, trembling slightly. The fear. It tastes like metal, like old pennies. A laugh track played. Davies let it run, clip after clip. Me describing the biting cold of a Berlin winter, overlaid with a filter that put a silly animated hat on my head. Me trying to explain the weight of a secret, my words twisted into a nonsensical auto-tuned remix. In one particularly cruel video, Jake had asked me about the loss of a comrade, a man named Thomas. My voice, thick with a grief that was still raw after 60 years, was sped up to sound like a chipmunk. "He didn't come back," my squeaky voice lamented, immediately followed by a viral soundbite of a comedian shouting, "Awkward!" Susan dabbed at a dry eye with a tissue. David sank lower in his chair, his face turning a shade of green. Jake watched the screen, a small smile playing on his lips as he relived his creative genius. "As you can see," Davies said, pausing the montage on a freeze frame of my face, my eyes wide with distress. These are not the coherent memories of a healthy mind. They are fragmented, nonsensical narratives. She speaks of missions in Prague, of secret codes, of poison pills. He gave a small, indulgent chuckle. It's the stuff of spy movies, not the life of a retired librarian from Maple Creek. Her grandson, in his own way, was trying to make sense of it, to engage with her on her level. He painted Jake as a loving, if misguided, grandchild trying to connect. He painted me as a liability, a woman lost in a fog of dementia who could no longer distinguish truth from the fictions she'd concocted to give her quiet life meaning. The panel, a retired judge named Arthur Galloway, a clinical psychologist named Dr. Aris, and a social worker named Ms. Chen, watched me. I offered them nothing. No tears, no outrage, no denial. I just sat there, a blank canvas onto which they could project all of their assumptions. My silence was my shield and my weapon. They thought it was resignation. They had no idea. It was the calm before the storm. The family seeks conservatorship, Davies concluded, his voice resonating with false gravity. To protect Lillian from herself. To manage her finances, which she is no longer capable of doing, and to ensure she receives the appropriate level of care for her condition. They are doing this out of love. Judge Galloway, a man with tired eyes that had seen every flavour of human greed, turned his gaze from the screen to me. His expression was unreadable. But I sensed a flicker of something. Not pity, but a weary sort of curiosity. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You've heard the presentation from Mr. Davies. Do you have a response? Anything you'd like to say in your own defence?" I took a slow breath, letting the silence stretch. I could feel Susan's impatient glare, David's anxious energy. Mr. Finch, seated a few feet behind me, gave a nearly imperceptible nod. It was time. I didn't look at my family. I didn't look at their lawyer. I looked directly at the panel, meeting each of their gazes in turn. When I spoke, my voice was not the frail, reedy thing they had heard in Jake's videos. It was low, clear, and steady. It was a voice that had given orders in hushed tones in the back alleys of hostile cities. "I do not wish to offer a defence," I said. "I wish to tell a story." A flicker of annoyance crossed Davies' face. He started to rise to object, but Judge Galloway held up a hand, silencing him. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Go on, Mrs. Vance." Prague, January 1972. Operation Silent Frost. The clinical precision of the words hung in the air, a stark contrast to the chaotic nonsense of the TikToks. Dr. Aris, the psychologist, picked up her pen. "My objective," I continued, my voice devoid of emotion, was to neutralize and extract a high-level Stasi informant, codenamed Pilgrim, who was embedded within the Czechoslovakian secret police. He had signaled his intent to defect, but was under constant surveillance. A public extraction was impossible, a quiet one was required. As I spoke, Mr. Finch rose silently from his chair. He carried 3 slim black binders. He placed one in front of Judge Galloway, one in front of Dr. Aris, and one in front of Ms. Chen. He opened each to the first page and then returned to his seat. The meet was scheduled for 0200 hours on January 18th on the west bank of the Vltava River, directly under the third statue from the Malastrana end of the Charles Bridge. The recognition signal was a copy of Goethe's Faust, held in the left hand, spine up. The counter signal was a question about the time, answered with, "The clock tower is silent tonight." I saw Dr. Arris's eyes flick down to the page in front of her, then back up to my face. A small frown formed between her eyebrows. Pilgrim was paranoid, and rightly so. He insisted on a dead drop for the final instructions. The location was a loose brick in the wall of the old Jewish cemetery. The instructions, written on flash paper in a cipher based on a Vivaldi composition, detailed the method of his neutralization. It was not to be a kidnapping. It was to appear as a medical emergency. I described the tool for the job. Not a weapon, but a specialized auto-injector disguised as a fountain pen. The payload was a chemical compound of our own design, a synthetic neurotoxin derived from tetrodotoxin mixed with a powerful amnestic agent. It was engineered to induce a state of catatonic paralysis that would mimic a catastrophic stroke. It was survivable, but only with a specific, time-sensitive antidote that only we possessed. The induced amnesia would wipe the preceding 48 hours, ensuring he couldn't betray the extraction network, even if he was captured and revived by his own people. Mr. Davies scoffed audibly. "Your Honour, this is precisely the kind of elaborate fantasy I was referring to. It's preposterous." Judge Galloway didn't even look at him. He was reading the document in front of him, his expression grim. "Be quiet, Mr. Davies," he murmured, not looking up. I continued, my gaze fixed on the panel. The operation was successful. At 02:14 hours, I bumped into Pilgrim as he exited a tavern on Karlova Street. The injection was administered to his left thigh through his trousers. He collapsed 2 minutes later. An ambulance, manned by our assets, arrived in 4. He was declared to have suffered a cerebral hemorrhage at the local hospital and was medically evacuated to a specialist clinic in West Germany the next day. He lived out the rest of his life as a history professor in Munich. I paused, then added, "His name was Klaus Richter. He passed away from natural causes in 2008. He liked to sail." Silence descended upon the room. It was thick and heavy. Judge Galloway slowly closed the binder in front of him. The cover bore a single stark seal, that of the Central Intelligence Agency. The top of the page, I could see from my angle, was stamped in red ink. Declassified. Top secret /SI/no fawn. Dr. Arris was staring at me, her professional detachment completely gone, replaced by sheer, unadulterated awe. Susan's face had gone from smugly concerned to slack-jawed confusion. David was looking back and forth between the panel and me, a dawning, sickening understanding on his face. He finally understood that the bedtime stories I tried to tell his children weren't fairy tales, they were confessions. Judge Galloway cleared his throat. "Mr. Finch," he said, his voice now laced with a steely authority. "Does your client have anything else to present to this panel?" "We do, Your Honour," Finch said calmly. He nodded to a young woman at the back of the room, his paralegal. She stood and connected a laptop to the large monitor. "Mr. Davies has presented edited material from my client's grandson's social media account," Finch stated. "We would like to present the original, unedited source footage recovered from the device's cloud backup." A new video filled the screen. It was shaky, clearly filmed on a phone. It showed the same armchair, the same attic room, but the sound was different. There was no pop music, no sound effects. There was only Jake's voice, wheedling and cruel, and my own, laced with a pain that was horribly real. "Come on, Grandma, just one more," Jake's voice said from behind the camera. "Tell me the one about the man in the trench coat again. The one you had to, Did you shoot him? Was there a lot of blood? My followers think that stuff is epic." When the primes of Janyan to Porter, and my voice on the recording was thin, trembling. "Jake, please, that's not a story. That was a person. It's not for your games. Please, turn that off." The camera zoomed in on my face. I looked exhausted, cornered. "You don't understand," I pleaded. "To remember it costs something." "Oh my God, you're so dramatic," Jake's voice sighed. "Fine, just tell me about the poison pill again. Was it blueberry flavored?" He snickered. The camera perspective lurched as I reached for it. "Stop it, Jake. That's enough. Please." My voice cracked on the final word, a raw, desperate sound that echoed in the silent, sterile room. The video ended. No one spoke. The smugness had not just dissolved from Jake's face. It had been violently scraped away, leaving behind the pale, terrified face of a boy who had just been publicly flayed. He stared at the blank screen, his mouth slightly open, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. He looked at his mother, but Susan wasn't looking at him. Her face was a frozen mask of horror, her eyes wide as she finally understood what the panel was seeing. Not a grandson's playful antics, but the slow, methodical torture of an elderly woman for public amusement. Dr. Aris put her pen down with a sharp click. Her voice was cold, clinical, and utterly damning. "What we have just witnessed," she said, her eyes boring into Susan and then Jake, "is not evidence of senility or cognitive decline on the part of Mrs. Vance. It is a textbook example of coercive control and psychological elder abuse. The distress she exhibited was not a symptom of a delusion, but a direct and rational response to being cruelly harassed and exploited by her own family." David made a small, strangled sound and put his head in his hands. Susan's carefully constructed facade of concern shattered, revealing the ugly, greedy woman beneath, her face contorted in a snarl of panicked rage. "This is a trick. He's twisting it. She's a confused old woman. She was cut off by the conference room door swinging open. It wasn't Finch's team. It was a young paralegal from Mr. Davis' own firm. She looked panicked, holding her phone out like it was a venomous snake. "Mr. Davis," she whispered urgently, rushing to his side. "You need to see this. It just broke. It's everywhere." Davis snatched the phone, his face paling as he read the screen. His eyes darted up to me, wide with a new kind of fear, a professional fear, the fear of a man who realised he's walked into a minefield he didn't know existed. Judge Galloway's patience had run out. "What is it, counsel?" he demanded. Davis, looking stunned, could only point at the large monitor. Put it on the screen." The paralegal fumbled with the cables. A moment later, a web page filled the monitor. It was the website of a major international news organisation, and there, at the top of the page, was the breaking headline: "American Hero or Assassin? The Secret Life of Maple Creek's Lillian Nightingale Vance." Next to the headline were two photos. One was a recent picture of me, walking into the courthouse that very morning. The other was a black and white photograph from 1968. A young woman with my eyes stared out, her face hard and beautiful and dangerous. The caption beneath it read, "Lillian Vance, known in CIA circles as the operative Nightingale, circa her deployment in East Berlin." The article, written by a Pulitzer-winning investigative journalist named Daniel Petrov, was visible below. Snippets of text confirmed everything. Operation Silent Frost, Berlin. The names of fallen agents. Decades of secrets, meticulously sourced and confirmed by recently declassified intelligence files. laid bare for the entire world to see. My tedious narratives were now a matter of public record. My delusions were front-page news. I finally looked at my family. I looked at David, his face ashen, staring at the screen as if he'd seen a ghost. I looked at Susan, her mouth opening and closing silently, the realization of what she had tried to steal, and from whom, crashing down on her. Her petty suburban greed had led her to try and cage a creature she couldn't possibly comprehend. And I looked at Jake. He was shaking, his eyes locked on the screen, on the article that had just turned his viral TikTok joke into a national scandal, with him cast as the villain. Their world wasn't just crumbling, it had been vaporized. The small, pathetic cage they had built for me had been obliterated, and they were now standing exposed in the blast crater. Judge Galloway banged a small, symbolic gavel, though the room was already deathly silent. This panel finds Lillian Vance to be of sound mind, fully competent, and in complete control of her faculties, he declared, his voice ringing with finality. The petition for conservatorship is hereby denied with extreme prejudice. This hearing is concluded. Mr. Davies collapsed into his chair as if his strings had been cut. My family sat frozen, trapped in the harsh glare of the projector screen. I did not smile. I did not offer a word of comfort or a glance of triumph. I simply stood, straightened the jacket of my suit, and picked up my handbag. Mr. Finch held the door open for me. I walked out of the bone-coloured room, leaving them to the silence and the ruins. The war was over. I had won. I walked out of that hearing room, not into the sunlight of freedom, but into the sterile, air-conditioned quiet of a war well and truly over. The victory didn't sing in my veins. It settled, heavy and cold, like a stone at the bottom of a deep well. David and Susan were ghosts, their faces hollowed out by public humiliation. Jake was a child again, not in his youth, but in his utter, slack-jawed incomprehension of consequence. They followed me out, not as family, but as a defeated entourage. The silence in the car ride back to the house, a roaring vacuum, where their insults and manipulations used to be. That house. It wasn't a home anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. It was a museum of my own slow erasure. Each room a testament to a part of me they had tried to smother. The attic where I was stored away. The living room where I was mocked. The kitchen where I was a burden. Now, stepping through the front door, I felt nothing. No nostalgia, no anger. Just the quiet, clear-eyed assessment of an asset that needed to be liquidated. 2 days later, a "for sale" sign was hammered into the lawn. Susan saw it from the kitchen window, and a sound escaped her, a thin, strangled gasp. It wasn't the sound of someone losing their home. It was the sound of a queen realizing her castle was made of sand. David confronted me, his face a blotchy mess of rage and disbelief. "You can't do this," he sputtered. "This is our home. Where are we supposed to go?" I looked at my son, this man in his 50s who had never truly grown up, and felt a profound and final detachment. "It was never your home, David," I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. "It was your father's. And then it was mine. You were merely tenants, and your lease has expired. They thought I would make them homeless. They expected a final, dramatic cruelty, a flourish of vengeance they could point to and say, "See, we were right, she is mad." But that would have been an emotional act, and I was done with emotion. I was in the business of logistics now. Nightingale had always been better at logistics than Lillian. I didn't make them homeless. That would have been a kindness, a clean break. Instead, I met with my lawyers, the ones Finch had recommended, and I laid out my terms. It wasn't a will, it was a severance package. I took a significant portion of the trust, my trust, earned with blood and silence, and used it to create a new one, a trust in their name. The lawyer, a sharp man named Mr. Davies, read the stipulations, his pen hovering over the paper. "Mrs. Vance," he began, a note of caution in his voice. "This is highly unorthodox." "Is it illegal?" I asked. "No, but it's restrictive. A small 2-bedroom apartment, rental paid directly, a monthly stipend that barely covers basic utilities and groceries. It's a financial leash, a very short one." "It's a starter budget," I corrected him, "for people starting over. There is one other condition." And I told him the most important part. The funds, the roof over their heads, everything was contingent upon one non-negotiable term. David, Susan, and Jake were required to attend weekly therapy sessions. Not just any therapy, the sessions had to be with a specialist in narcissistic personality disorder and familial abuse dynamics, a therapist I had personally vetted and selected from a list Finch had procured for me, a woman in the city whose entire career was built on dismantling the kind of toxic architecture my family had perfected. Their attendance would be reported back to the trust administrators monthly. No session, no stipend. It was that simple. Mr. Davis looked at me, a flicker of something, awe, perhaps, or fear, in his eyes. "You are not just taking their house, are you?" he murmured. "No," I said, signing the document with a steady hand. "I'm taking their control, their self-delusion, their shared reality that allowed them to believe their cruelty was justified. They built me a cage of their own making for years. I'm just returning the favor. Only my cage is designed to heal, whether they want it to or not." The house sold within a week. I packed only one box for myself, the battered leather briefcase with its contents intact. The rest I left. The furniture they'd picked out, the photos they'd arranged, the cheap world's best grandma mug still sitting on the kitchen counter. Let the new owners deal with the ghosts, my war was over. I had no interest in occupying the battlefield. My new world order began not with a bang, but with the quiet crunch of tires on a gravel road. I now live in a place where the silence is a presence, not an absence. A secluded cabin nestled by a lake in Montana, where the sky is so vast it feels like a different planet from the cramped, judgmental atmosphere of my former life. The air here is thin and cold and clean. It hurts to breathe in at first, but it scours you from the inside out. I spend my days writing. Not for the world, not for validation, not for a publisher. I write for myself. I sit at a simple wooden desk that looks out over the water, and I fill pages with the truth. I write about the metallic taste of fear in a Berlin alleyway. I write about the weight of a secret held for 50 years. I write about the hollow ache of being unseen by your own blood. I am finally declassifying my own soul, one sentence at a time. The quiet hum of the refrigerator and the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore have replaced the sound of their mockery. This is freedom. Not the absence of a cage, but the construction of a sanctuary. One evening, as the sun bled across the water in strokes of orange and purple, the phone rang. The sound was a violation, a harsh, electronic shriek in my analog world. It was from a number I didn't recognize, but I knew the old world was calling. I let it ring, watching a lone hawk circle high above the pines. On the fifth ring, I picked it up. Hello? A raw, broken sound met my ear, a sob thick with tears and regret. Grandma? It was Chloe. Grandma, I'm so sorry. I said nothing. I just listened to the sound of her heart breaking over the line, a delayed echo of what had happened to my own. I didn't know, she wept, her words tumbling out between gasps. I mean, I knew, but I never saw the whole video.
The one they played at the hearing, what Jake was saying to you, what you were saying. Oh, God, Grandma, he was so cruel. We were all so cruel. I'm so sorry. Her apology was the first genuine thing I'd heard from a member of my family in decades. It was a drop of clean water in a poisoned well. 10 years ago, it would have been everything. It would have cracked open the ice around my heart. But the ice was gone now. It hadn't been melted. It had been carved away, leaving something harder and more permanent in its place. I looked out the window at the twilight deepening over the lake. I listened to my granddaughter's anguish, a pain so palpable it felt like a physical presence in my quiet cabin. My face betrayed no emotion. My hand did not tremble. I didn't offer comfort. I didn't offer absolution. Forgiveness is a currency I no longer trade in. It is a gift given to the guilty to ease their burden, and I was no longer in the business of making them feel better. After a long Weighted silence, filled only by her ragged breathing, I spoke.
My voice was not unkind, but it was not warm, it was neutral. It was the voice of an observer. Tell me more. My revenge was never about getting my freedom back, it was about taking theirs. It was about locking them in a room with the one thing they could never escape, themselves, and I, the warden, would simply listen.